Our top focus: after carrying out relentless airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has told his men to get ready for a ground offensive.
Well, Israel has been preparing for this, and the same was echoed by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he met the soldiers, calling on them to fight till victory is secured. Now, Israel has massed tens of thousands of troops along the border with Gaza following the October 7th cross-border massacre by Hamas militants. Meeting Israel's infantry soldiers on the Gaza border, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant urged the troops to be organized and ready to enter the Gaza Strip. He, however, did not mention when this invasion would begin.
הפקודה תגיע. תודה רבה חבר'ה, סומכים עליכם בהצלחה, ואנחנו עוד ניפגש, ומי שרואה עכשיו את עזה מרחוק יראה אותה מבפנים. אני מבטיח לכם. בהצלחה.
Meanwhile, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also met his combat soldiers at the Gaza border. He reaffirmed the troops that the entire state of Israel stands behind them and vowed to emerge victorious after the war.
אני פה עם הלוחמים של גולני, הם באים מכל חלקי הארץ, הם לחמו כמו אריות, אם ילחמו כמו אריות, אתם מוכנים להמשך? כן! אנחנו הולכים לנצח בכל העוצמה, אתם מוכנים? כן! כל עם ישראל עומד מאחוריכם, ואנחנו ניתן את המכה הקשה לאויבים שלנו, כדי שנשיג ניצחון לניצחון. מוכנים? כן!
Meanwhile, as Israel continues to pound Gaza, new satellite images show a number of people taking shelter in schools and hospitals around Gaza City.
Now, as the war drags on with no peace in sight, the concerns over its expansion remain. The conflict it's already spilled into the wider West Asian region, and many Iran-backed militant groups are seen to be involved. And the heavy U.S. presence in the region and its involvement in the wars is in their crosshairs.
In the latest, the Pentagon says that a U.S. Navy warship intercepted 3 cruise missiles and several drones launched by the Iran-backed Houthi movement from Yemen. Though the Pentagon said it has no certainty of the target of the drones and missiles, but they were potentially bound towards Israel.
To that end, the crew of the guided missile destroyer USS Carney, operating in the northern Red Sea earlier today, shot down 3 land attack cruise missiles and several drones that were launched by Houthi forces in Yemen. This action was a demonstration of the integrated air and missile defense architecture that we have built in the Middle East and that we are prepared to utilize whenever necessary to protect our partners and our interests in this important region. There were no casualties to U.S. forces and none that we know of to any civilians on the ground.
And while U.S. President Joe Biden was in Israel on Wednesday, U.S. military forces in Iraq were targeted in 2 separate drone attacks, with one causing injuries to a small number of troops. The Islamic resistance in Iraq, again an Iran-backed group, claimed the responsibility for the attacks.
Meanwhile, tensions are already soaring in northern Israeli front between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah group, which is based in Lebanon. Now, in the latest, the Lebanese army has alleged that a journalist was killed by Israeli gunfire on Thursday in a southern Lebanon border area.
On the other hand, Israel's military said earlier that its forces had targeted Hezbollah infrastructure and struck 3 people who attempted to launch anti-tank missiles at Israel. On the Lebanese army's allegations, Israel says it's investigating the matter.
Meanwhile, Israel's military is evacuating 28 communities near the northern border with Lebanon because of escalating tensions, and Saudi Arabia has also advised all its nationals in Lebanon to leave the country immediately. Now, the US president says militant group Hamas and Russia are both out to annihilate democracies in an impassioned speech to the nation from the Oval Office.
Joe Biden, seeking re-election in 2024, is preparing to push Congress for a massive $100 billion package that includes funding for Israel as well as Ukraine. Presidents traditionally reserve speech from the solemn setting of the Oval Office for moments of key national significance.
Fresh from a whirlwind trip to Israel, the 80-year-old Democrat is going all out now to win over war-weary voters and hardline Republicans. Biden stated the stakes are too great for Washington to abandon Ukraine and Israel, and added that the U.S. remains a global guardian for freedom. He said, and I'm quoting here, "America is a beacon to the world still."
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it. Hamas' stated purpose for existing is the destruction of the state of Israel and the murder of Jewish people. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields, and innocent Palestinian families are suffering greatly because of them.
Washington is backing Israel in its war with Hamas, even as the Russia-Ukraine war shows no signs of an endgame. Tying together two conflicts an ocean away from the United States is a bid by Biden to frame them as part of a bigger struggle to shape the world order and protect Americans at home. Biden had earlier mentioned a global inflection point that's bigger than party or politics.
Hard-right Republicans and a growing number of voters are strongly opposed to adding to the nearly $44 billion in security assistance that U.S. has committed to Ukraine since Moscow launched its invasion in 2022.
Biden hopes to break the logjam by hitching it to funding for Israel, Taiwan and the troubled southern border with Mexico. Recasting the trio of issues as part of the same overriding task of ensuring U.S. security, the U.S. president exhorted the Congress to approve urgent military support for Israel and Ukraine, saying the aid would boost U.S. security for generations.
He said while he was in Tel Aviv that he would ask Congress for an unprecedented package for Israel's defense this week. And as per reports, the package will include $10 billion in emergency assistance for Israel and $60 billion for Ukraine. The U.S. president spoke to Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky hours before this speech.
Biden has also been striking a statesman-like tone on the Israel-Hamas war with an eye on voters, where there is strong support for Israel, even if left-wing Democrats oppose his stance.
Now, in Tel Aviv on Wednesday, the U.S. president backed Israel as it gears up for a ground invasion of Gaza after Hamas attacks killed more than 1,400 people. But he also brokered a deal to get some aid through Egypt into the Gaza Strip. The threat of a wider West Asian conflict, meanwhile, looms in the background. U.S. has already moved 2 aircraft carriers into the eastern Mediterranean to deter Iran or Lebanon's Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran, both allies of Hamas, from getting involved.
Now, the United States' involvement plays a major role, and aid, that has been a major concern as well. And for the latest on this, our correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from New York. Take a look.
President Biden, in his address from the Oval Office, the second since becoming president, made a direct appeal to the American people, saying supporting Ukraine and Israel now will help America for generations to come. He made this speech just one day before he's expected to make an urgent request to Congress for north of $100 billion, not only for aid to Israel and Ukraine, but also Taiwan and money for the U.S.-Mexico border. During his speech, time and again, the president compared Hamas and Vladimir Putin's Russia with one another, saying while they do pose different threats, they have one thing in common. They want to annihilate a neighboring democracy. The president said that supporting Ukraine and Israel is a matter of national security. The question is whether he was able to articulate that to the American people effectively. During his speech, the president, who's clearly concerned about hate here in America, said that Jewish families and Muslims should not feel hate and discrimination against them. As the president was delivering his speech, it was reported that U.S. forces were attacked in Iraq. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
All right. Now, to discuss things further, for more on this, we are being also joined by Jacob Olidor. He's live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Olidor is a director of research at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, Gemender Center for Defense and Strategy. So, welcome to World DNA.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mr. Olidor, let's start right off with there. Biden has asked for $100 billion. That includes, military support for Israel and Ukraine, saying it would boost U.S. security for generations. Now, talk to us about the implications here and what is U.S. aiming to achieve for generations?
It's a good question. You know, the speech was a little bit of a departure from President Biden's very strong and consistent rhetoric since October 7th, since the horrendous attack by Hamas against Israel. You know, this speech, of course, is trying to make a case that both wars are connected, and they have connectivity to them. But fundamentally, they're two different issues. And while it's important to make a case for aid to Ukraine, the threat is very different than that posed by Iran. Ultimately, it's Iran directing Hamas in the attack against Israel. So I think that was probably the biggest thing missing from a speech that actually, in my view, kind of touched on maybe too many topics. But the one that was missing, it received a passing mention, was Iran. And that was really the policy change and the focus that should have been the emphasis on his remarks when he was in Israel. It should have been emphasized a bit more today, and certainly against the backdrop of Iran-backed militias targeting U.S. bases and Hezbollah obviously mobilizing protesters.
So also let's talk about what's happening in the region on ground. In fact, Israeli Defense Minister said they'll be seeing Gaza from inside. What do you make of these comments, given that it's already been several days since Israel, of course, initially said it suggested a ground offensive?
Well, of course, I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, everybody is sort of waiting, and, you know, the ground offensive was initially expected last week. It's been delayed. We've also heard statements from IDF spokespersons that it won't resemble what people expect it to look like. So I think, you know, we're also all in the same position, sort of waiting to see what happens. I think it's fair to say that Gaza is just a highly complex environment. It'll be a very, very fraught operation, not to mention the hostage dimension. And so certainly we'll be waiting to watch this very, very tenuous situation unfold.
Jacob, I just want to go back to what you mentioned earlier, that, you know, this was like President Biden's speech. It kind of linked the two wars, Israel and Ukraine, what is happening in Israel with Hamas and, of course, between Ukraine and Russia. Talk to us a little bit more about that, if you could elaborate further on what U.S. gains from this speech, or at least what the Biden administration seems to gain from these kind of connections that they're trying to form with the speech.
I think what it gains fundamentally, I mean, I think it's an important case to make. I mean, I think that the support for Ukraine is a righteous cause. It's an important case. It's defending the sovereignty of a state. And obviously, President Biden who has yet to make a real clear policy statement about Ukraine. This might have been the closest he's come to it. And obviously, it's on the eve of a very substantial aid package to Ukraine. You know, that's leaving aside kind of the way in which he's implemented the policy. But it's a very distinct issue from the war that Israel faces right now, which is a defensive war, which is actually being waged by one of several Iranian proxies in the region. That, I would say, is the thing missing from the president's comments throughout since early October, is that it's not just Israel and Hamas. I mean, you cannot truly capture accurately what's happening on the ground if you don't take into account the Iranian hand in coordinating, supporting, training Hamas, without which it would not have been successful in its attack. And certainly you're seeing that with escalatory rhetoric and actions on the northern border and elsewhere in the region. And so I think so long as that focus, that explicit recognition of Iran's role, which has been corroborated in several media reports throughout the last few weeks, so long as that's not the case, even the important military deterrent and support that we've provided, that will be limited in its effect.
Right, sir, absolutely. Also, 2 missiles were believed to be fired towards Israel from Yemen recently, while Israel's fight with Hezbollah continues in the north. Now, this has been a major question as well, and diplomatic overtures, they've come with the aim of also trying to contain this war and stop it from spilling into a wider regional conflict. Is this no longer just the Israel versus Hamas war? What's next, in your opinion?
I think it's bound to, and I've written this as well, and JINSA has written daily numerous research projects, which you can find on our website, jinsa.org. But, you know, I've written actually on the day of the Hamas attack that this risks escalating into a regional conflict depending on the actions of the United States. And so I understand that the administration is trying very hard to contain it to Israel and Hamas in Gaza. But incidentally, the way to do that is actually to address the root cause of everything, which is Iran. And so long as Iran is not implicated directly, it will feel free to advance its destructive agenda across the region, as we're seeing happen today.
All right. Thank you so much, Jacob Ollidor, for joining in and sharing all your insights on this. Pleasure talking to you. That was Mr. Ollidor, Director of Research at the Jinsas Jaimunder Center for Defense and Strategy, joining in on World Again.
Thank you very much.